let's kind of pivot over to like some people don't intend on creating fraud, but then
Yeah.
they sometimes marriages or what are some of the things we talked about before? Sometimes marriages or divorces might lead to BAH fraud just because of the way things happen. Kind of explain how that happens sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. These are cases that are highly defendable when you have these cases where you don't mean to commit fraud, but you get overpaid. And let's say you're on a deployment and you're on a 6 month or a 9 month deployment, you're underway, and your spouse is fed up with you, she's fed up with the military, and she divorces you. And let's say you're divorced in pick any location, but you don't get served with that divorce because you're underway. And maybe maybe she sends it to an email. Maybe you're doing it pro se. We don't have a lawyer, and you don't even know you're divorced. But maybe a divorce was finalized, or maybe a divorce. There's a lot of different scenarios here, and a divorce is finalized on day one, and you never turn that divorce decree in because once you're divorced, you have an obligation to turn that divorce decree in to stop the entitlements. I've seen cases where you have someone 6, 12 months that they're still getting paid, and maybe it's a $2,000, $3,000 a month entitlement where they were divorced and they didn't even realize they were divorced. And so that's not fraud. What that is maybe there's some level of culpability because you should have known to turn this in, but that's not fraud. You never intended to defraud the government. But I've still seen those cases charged at a general court martial. I've seen IPAC and S1 screw things up all day long. I've seen divorce paperwork turned in and never get put into a system. I've seen that. I've seen paperwork lost. So there are a lot of different scenarios where service members are legitimately trying to do the right thing, but for whatever reason, they continue to get paid. Then some prosecutor looks at it and they decide to charge them. Another question becomes, where are you actually entitled to BAH? This one becomes very, very complicated, and you have to look at the JFTR, the Joint Federal Travel Regulation. Let's say your spouse is intending on staying, I use Texas, for example, out at Fort Hood. Let's say they were intending on staying at Fort Hood, Texas. I'm going to use a higher BH location. Let's say that they were out at Miramar in San Diego, where you have fairly high BAH. And your spouse was intending to stay in Miramar, and maybe a parent got sick, or maybe something happened, and they moved, and they picked up and moved while you're on a 1 year unaccompanied tour, and they moved to Little Rock, where the BH is significantly less. They don't live in San Diego anymore, but where are they entitled to BAH? And this becomes very tricky in terms of the analysis and how you interpret the Joint Federal Travel Regulation. So I've seen that now where it triggers an audit. They're in Little Rock. They're getting San Francisco BAH. Maybe they've moved out of their apartment. Are they entitled to San Francisco BAH or not? And so that becomes a tricky area, and that becomes there's no easy answer. It becomes very fact specific on that, but that's more common than you think as well.
You can be convicted of being guilty even if your intent wasn't to be guilty, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so when the prosecutors get a hold of this, they're not, again, once the prosecutors look at this and the command looks at it, they're not saying, well, this person made a mistake. They've got a case on their hands of what they believe is fraud. They're going to charge you almost every single time. And so now you're going to have typically a general court martial, because these aren't, $500. You're not stealing an iPad out of the shopette. These are multiple $1,000s, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars of fraud. Prosecutors are going to charge you. They're going to go through an Article 32 hearing, and oftentimes these will go to trial, even though you had zero intent to defraud. And you can tell the prosecutors till you're blue in the face that there's no intent. They'll say, well, let a jury figure it out. And so oftentimes these types of cases, when I say a lot of these cases do go to trial, these are the types of cases I'm talking about where there's no intent to defraud, or there may be some negligence on a service member's part. They never intended to steal any money, and yet they're at a general court martial fighting for their freedom, where if they get convicted of this, now on their record they're going to have a larceny. It could be $30,000-$40,000 or more, maybe $100,000. Who knows what that is? And if you get convicted for that, you're going to prison. I mean, you are going to prison, or you're going to the brig or the confinement facility. And even if you're found not guilty of this, there's a civil side of this as well, because the military is going to try to recoup the funds. And so if you committed, if the military says that you stole or were overpaid, let's say $100,000, they're going to come after you for that. And that debt is, very hard to get around. And so they may place a $100,000 debt on your account. You have to be cognizant of that as well. You may beat the criminal side of it and then be stuck paying off a $100,000 debt on. So there's really two sides of this. There's the criminal side, and then there's the civil side of it as well. If you're involved in BAH fraud, you need to call my office immediately and do a consultation. You can reach us at area code 813-669-3500. Please get on my calendar. We'll schedule a full evaluation of your case. It will be in complete confidence, and we'll come up with a plan for how to deal with your situation.